Subjective Idealism in a New Reality Shift. Subjective number 1. The Origins of Subjective Idealism. You're delving into the origins of subjective idealism, a philosophical concept that's intrigued thinkers for centuries. This philosophy, also known as immaterialism or idealistic monism, posits that only minds and mental contents exist. It's a radical departure from materialist theories that argue for a reality independent of the human mind. Subjective idealism's roots can be traced back to the ancient Greek philosopher Protagoras, who famously asserted, "Man is the measure of all things." However, the concept wasn't fully developed until the 18th century, with Bishop George Berkeley's theory. Berkeley's interpretation, detailed in his works, a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge and 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philinus, declares that material objects only exist when perceived by a mind. It's through this lens that we see the inception of subjective idealism's core tenet: to be is to be perceived. Berkeley's views were new and revolutionary, but they laid a foundation for later philosophers such as Immanuel Kant, who proposed a more moderate form of idealism that allowed for a reality independent of human perception, but still fundamentally shaped by it. In essence, understanding subjective idealism isn't just about knowing its origins, but also grasping the evolution of the concept itself. It's a philosophy that's evoked new thought, debate, and reinterpretation for centuries, showcasing the power of human perception and the complexities of the mind's interplay with reality. Subjective number 2. Pioneers of subjective idealism. In your study, you'll encounter pioneers like George Berkeley, who asserted that nothing exists outside of the mind's perception. He championed subjective idealism, the philosophical stance that matter doesn't exist independently of the mind. This new idea turned the existing Cartesian and concept philosophies on their lead, challenging the widely accepted belief in objective reality. Berkeley wasn't alone in this new thinking. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, another trailblazer, proposed a similar view, although with a unique twist. He suggested that the universe is made up of simple substances he called monads, which can't be perceived by the senses, but only by the mind. This intriguing notion further supports the subjective idealist's perspective, suggesting a reality shaped and perceived exclusively through mental constructs. You will also find Arthur Schopenhauer lending weight to this philosophy. Drawing from Eastern thought, he argued that the world we perceive is merely a representation formed by our will. This echoes the subjective idealist's stance, asserting that reality is fundamentally a construct of the mind. In understanding these pioneers, you're not just learning about individuals. You're delving into a groundbreaking philosophy that dared to question the nature of reality. These thinkers didn't just ask, "What is real?" And also, "How do we know what's real?" Their contributions have shaped not only philosophical discourse, but also fields like cognitive science and quantum physics. Subjective number 3. Core concepts of subjective idealism. Diving deeper into this philosophy, you will experience with core concepts that challenge conventional understanding of reality and perception. Subjective idealism posits that nothing exists independently of the mind. Here, you're not merely an observer of the world, but rather its creator. This standpoint is a stark departure from the traditional belief in an objective reality that exists apart from our perceptions. You may be wondering, if everything is a mental construct, what about shared experiences? How can we all perceive the same thing? This is where subjective idealism gets interesting. It suggests that perceptions are not strictly personal, but are shaped by collective consciousness. In essence, we're all participating in crafting a shared reality. Yet, it's crucial to remember that in subjective idealism, these shared perceptions don't validate an independent, external reality. Instead, they merely reflect our shared mental constructs. Therefore, the very nature of reality is subjective, malleable, and intimately bound to our consciousness. To wrap your mind around this, consider a simple example: a tree falling in a forest. If no one is there to perceive it, does it make a sound, according to subjective idealism? The answer is no. The sound only exists if there's a mind to perceive it. This perspective can be quite challenging to accept, as it upends many ingrained beliefs about the nature of reality. However, understanding its core concepts is crucial to fully appreciate its philosophical implications. Now that you've grappled with these ideas, let's transition to comparing subjective idealism with its philosophical counterpart, objective idealism. Subjective number 4. Subjective idealism versus objective idealism. Now that you've got a handle on these concepts, let's pit them against their philosophical counterpart, objective idealism. While subjective idealism propounds that reality is shaped by our perceptions, objective idealism, in contrast, asserts that reality exists independently of human consciousness. In subjective idealism, you're the artist of your own world, crafting and molding reality based on your perceptions, thoughts, and experiences. This perspective emphasizes the power and primacy of human consciousness. Objective idealism, however, paints a different picture. It posits that reality is a construct of a universal mind or an objective consciousness. This implies that reality isn't a creation of individual minds, but exists independently, irrespective of whether it's perceived or not. The primary difference lies in the locus of control. Subjective idealism places the reins in your hand, asserting that your perception is the key to your reality. Conversely, objective idealism takes the reins away, stating that reality exists outside of your perception. You can think of subjective idealism as a bottom-up approach, starting with individual perceptions and experiences. In contrast, objective idealism is a top-down approach, beginning with a universal truth that trickles down to individual interpretations. Subjective number 5. The role of perception in subjective idealism. You will find that your perception plays a pivotal role in how you construct and make sense of your reality. According to this philosophical viewpoint, subjective idealism posits that our conscious perceptions are what fundamentally form our interpretation of the world. The world, in this view, isn't an independent, concrete entity, but rather a product of our individual minds. It's our perceptions that shape and color this reality. To delve deeper, consider how you perceive the color blue. This hue might evoke a sense of calm or perhaps sadness. Another person, however, might associate blue with feelings of joy or serenity. These differing interpretations underscore that our perceptions are not universal. They are inherently subjective, influenced by our individual experiences, cultural background, and value systems. Notably, subjective idealism doesn't deny the existence of an external world. Instead, it emphasizes that this world is knowable only through our perceptions. You don't experience a tree, for example, in its objective, unmediated form. You perceive it through your senses, its color, its texture, its scent. It's these sensory experiences that construct your reality of the tree. This perspective also invites us to question the reliability of our perceptions. Are they true reflections of reality, or are they, in fact, constructs of our mind? From the subjective idealist viewpoint, it's the latter. It's not the external world that shapes our perceptions, but our perceptions that shape the world. Understanding this philosophical stance requires a willingness to challenge our conventional ways of thinking, but it provides a compelling framework for exploring the nature of reality. Subjective number 6. Critiques of subjective idealism. While it's a fascinating concept, there are criticisms to consider when exploring subjective idealism. You might find it challenging to accept that the physical world only exists in our perceptions. Critics argue that this philosophical stance leads to solipsism, the view that only one's own mind is sure to exist. You will find it valuable to explore the critique from the standpoint of empirical science. Naturally, subjective idealism clashes with the objectivity that empirical science thrives on. How do you reconcile the existence of laws of physics, the consistency of the natural world, with the idea that it all exists merely within our perceptions? Critics assert that subjective idealism can't provide an adequate explanation for the predictability and regularity of nature. Moreover, consider the moral implications. If the world exists only within our perception, does this not absolve us of responsibility for our actions? Critics challenge subjective idealism on this basis, suggesting it could promote an unhealthy sense of self-centeredness and moral laxity. Lastly, examine the critique from a practical perspective. If we accept the premise of subjective idealism, how do we account for shared experiences? Critics argue that the commonality of human experiences indicates a reality independent of individual perception. Subjective number 7. Subjective idealism in the modern world. It's interesting to think about how this philosophical concept plays out in the modern world. Subjective idealism, the belief that reality is fundamentally mental and that only your own mental experiences can be known, appears to be especially relevant in today's digital, distinctive age. With the burgeoning of virtual reality technologies and social media platforms, you're constantly asked to negotiate the boundary between the physical world and your subjective mental experiences. Consider, for instance, how social media allows you to create personalized digital environments that mirror your inner thoughts, biases, and desires. These platforms, in a way, embody the tenets of subjective idealism. The reality they present is essentially a construction of your mind, informed by your unique perceptions and experiences. Similarly, virtual reality technologies can create immersive experiences that blur the line between external reality and internal mental constructs. However, it's critical to remember that this modern manifestation of subjective idealism is an enigma. While it can foster a deeper understanding of the self, it can also lead to solipsism, a belief that only your own mind is sure to exist. This can result in a heightened sense of isolation and a diminished capacity for empathy, as you may start to discount the reality and experiences of others. This analysis underscores how subjective idealism, despite its philosophical origins, remains a relevant concept in the digital age. It can be used to understand and navigate the shifting boundaries between physical and virtual realities, as well as personal and collective experiences. Now, let's delve into the influence of subjective idealism on psychology. Subjective number 8. The influence of subjective idealism on psychology. Moving deeper into this philosophy's impact, it's fascinating to see how it has shaped modern psychology, isn't it? Subjective idealism asserts that reality is fundamentally mental, and this has influenced the way psychologists view human consciousness and cognition. You have probably heard the phrase, perception is reality. It's a concept that's been widely adopted in cognitive psychology, isn't it? This idea is deeply rooted in subjective idealism, which posits that we can't know an objective reality outside of our perceptions. As a result, psychology has moved away from an objective understanding of the human mind and more towards understanding how our individual perceptions shape our realities. Consider cognitive behavioral therapy, a common psychological treatment. This approach, in essence, uses the principles of subjective idealism. It operates on the belief that by changing one's thought patterns, one can alter one's perception of reality and, therefore, one's emotional and behavioral responses. Subjective idealism also impacts the study of subjective well-being, doesn't it? Psychologists studying happiness often look at individuals' perceptions of their own lives rather than objective measures of success or wellness. The study of subjective well-being is, thus, heavily influenced by subjective idealism's proposition that reality is dependent on the perceiver. Subjective number 9. The impact of subjective idealism on science. You might be surprised to learn how this particular philosophy has significantly influenced various fields of science, don't you think? Subjective idealism, the belief that reality is fundamentally mental, has been a thought-provoking topic in scientific discourse. Although it's sometimes dismissed as metaphysical speculation, it has substantial implications for how we understand and interpret scientific phenomena. You see, subjective idealism proposes that all objects are dependent on the perception and cognition of the mind. In essence, it's the mind that gives form to all matter. This perspective can be unsettling, especially when applied to empirical sciences that rely heavily on observable, measurable phenomena. However, it's not without its merits. Consider quantum physics, a field where subjective idealism has found a welcoming home. There is growing agreement that the observer is critical in determining the behavior of quantum particles. The act of measurement, it seems, can influence a particle's state, lending credence to the idea that reality is, at least in part, observer-dependent. It's also worth noting the impact of subjective idealism on scientific methodology. If all reality is mind-dependent, then any scientific observation is inevitably shaped by the observer's mental constructs. This doesn't dismiss the value of empirical exploration, but rather underscores the need for rigorous introspection and scrutiny of our assumptions. Subjective number 10. The relationship between subjective idealism and religion. It's intriguing how this mind-centric philosophy intertwines with religious beliefs, isn't it? Subjective idealism, affirming the primacy of the mind in consciousness, resonates quite perfectly with various religious doctrines. As you delve deeper, you'll unearth the striking parallels. First, consider the idea of God as an omnipotent, conscious being. In many religious traditions, God is often seen as the ultimate subject with infinite consciousness, creating and perceiving all of reality. This concept of God aligns with the core premise of subjective idealism, which sees consciousness as the primary reality. Next, think about the concept of faith. In many religions, faith involves believing in things that are not directly observable. Isn't this akin to the subjective idealist's assertion that reality exists primarily in one's mind? It's a parallel you can't ignore. Moreover, the idea of spiritual realms and afterlife, common in many religions, can also find echoes in subjective idealism. The spiritual realms, much like the idealist's reality, are not tangible or physically accessible, yet they're considered real because they're perceived by the mind. Finally, consider the practice of meditation in religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. Isn't it a way to gain control over one's mind and perception, similar to what subjective idealism promotes? Subjective number 11. Subjective idealism in literature and art. In literature and art, you'll find that this philosophy's footprint is equally profound, shaping narratives and inspiring creativity. Subjective idealism, the belief that reality is a product of our minds, has been the driving force behind countless works of art and literature. You might be familiar with the saying, "Beauty is in the eye of the beholder," a mantra that encapsulates the essence of subjective idealism. It suggests that perception is key in determining reality. In literature, this perspective allows authors to explore the subjectivity of their characters' experiences, giving birth to the stream of consciousness technique seen in novels such as James Joyce's Ulysses or Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. These works delve deeply into the psyche of the characters, illustrating how our understanding of the world is ultimately shaped by our individual perceptions. In the realm of art, subjective idealism has had a significant influence on the development of movements such as Expressionism and Surrealism. Artists like Edvard Munch or Salvador Dali didn't aim for objective representation of reality, but rather sought to convey the emotional and psychological experiences of the human mind. Their work is a testament to the power of subjective idealism, illustrating how our perceptions and emotions can shape our understanding of reality. Subjective number 12. Subjective idealism and quantum physics. Now, you have explored how subjective idealism manifests in literature and art. Let's delve into a more complex arena, quantum physics. Here, you'll find that subjective idealism isn't just a philosophical concept, but one that potentially explains some of the most puzzling phenomena in the quantum world. Quantum physics, with its wave-particle duality and uncertainty principle, suggests that the observer's role shapes the reality we perceive. This concept mirrors subjective idealism's assertion that the mind constructs reality. It's as if the quantum world is saying, what you see isn't an objective reality, but a projection of your mind's interpretation. Consider the famous double-slit experiment. When particles like electrons are unobserved, they don't behave as individual entities, but as probability waves. However, when observed, they manifest as particles. This wave collapse suggests that the act of observation, essentially a mental process, determines the physical reality of the particles. Likewise, the quantum entanglement phenomenon, where particles remain interconnected no matter the distance, challenges the notion of separate, independent entities. It's akin to the subjective idealist's view of a unified, mind-dependent reality. It's intriguing to think that subjective idealism might offer a philosophical framework for understanding these quantum oddities. However, remember, this is a difficult subject. Many physicists resist the idea of a mind-dependent reality, arguing that quantum phenomena can be explained without invoking consciousness. In this context, subjective idealism becomes not just a philosophical perspective, but a potential bridge between philosophy and quantum physics, fostering a deeper understanding of the enigmatic quantum world. Subjective number 13. Subjective idealism in Eastern philosophies. You will find that Eastern philosophies, much like quantum physics, also entertain the thought of mind-created realities. From the Buddhist concept of Maya or illusion to the Hindu belief in Brahman as the ultimate reality, subjective idealism finds resonance. In Buddhism, the notion of subjective idealism is reflected in the doctrine of emptiness, or shunyata. This philosophy suggests that phenomena don't possess inherent, independent reality, but are instead dependent on our perceptions and mental constructs. You perceive reality as you do because of the constructs and frameworks your mind has created. Similarly, in Hindu philosophy, the concept of Maya suggests that the physical world isn't the ultimate reality, but an illusion created by our minds. The ultimate reality, Brahman, is beyond human perception and understanding, and it's only through transcending this illusion that one can perceive Brahman. These philosophies underscore the idea that the world as we know, it's largely a product of our own minds. They suggest that our perceived reality is shaped not just by the physical world, but by our thoughts, ideas, and perceptions. However, while these philosophies resonate with the concept of subjective idealism, they also differ in critical ways. For instance, the goal in these Eastern philosophies is often to transcend the mind-created realities, rather than to change or manipulate them, as proposed by subjective idealism. Subjective number 14. The metaphysical implications of subjective idealism. Diving into the metaphysical implications, it's clear that this concept challenges your basic perceptions about reality and existence. Subjective idealism posits that there's no reality beyond perception. In essence, it's your mind that shapes and gives meaning to the world around you. You might ask, what's the significance? Well, this philosophy defies the conventional view that reality is independent of our minds. It emphasizes that your perception isn't simply a mirror reflecting an external world, but an active creator of your reality. This could reshuffle your understanding of the universe and your role within it. In terms of ethics, subjective idealism might give you a newfound sense of responsibility. If your thoughts shape your reality, then you're essentially the architect of your own world. There's no room for blaming external circumstances for your experiences, as you're inherently intertwined with them. On an epistemological level, this concept questions the reliability of our senses. If everything outside is a projection of your mind, then what's the guarantee that what you see, hear, or touch is real? It undermines the certainty you might have about your knowledge of the outside world. Lastly, from an ontological perspective, subjective idealism could lead you to question the very nature of existence. If there's no objective reality, then what does it mean to exist? It's a deep existential question that challenges the foundation of your understanding of selfhood and existence. Therefore, subjective idealism isn't just a philosophical theory, but a new shift in how you perceive and interact with your world. Subjective number 15. The epistemological arguments for subjective idealism. Having delved deeply into the metaphysical implications of subjective idealism, let's now pivot to the epistemological arguments that buttress this philosophy. Epistemology, as you know, concerns itself with the nature and scope of knowledge, probing questions like what can we know? And how can we know it? Subjective idealism posits that reality is essentially mental and subjective. Thus, the epistemological arguments for this stance are intrinsically tied to our understanding and experience of knowledge. Firstly, there's the argument of perceptual relativity. This implies that our perception of reality varies based on personal, subjective experiences. What you perceive isn't an objective truth, but a subjective construct molded by your senses and mental faculties. For instance, you might perceive a certain color differently than another person does due to differences in your visual apparatus. Secondly, subjective idealism argues against the possibility of knowing an independent external reality. If all knowledge is inevitably subjective, since it's filtered through our minds, then it's impossible to know anything objectively outside of our own perception. You can't step outside your own mind to verify the existence of an independent reality. Finally, there's the argument from illusion and hallucination. These phenomena suggest that our senses can't always be trusted, as they're susceptible to error, further casting doubt on the possibility of objective knowledge. In short, the epistemological arguments for subjective idealism emphasize the role of the mind in constructing our perceived reality and question our ability to access or understand an objective reality independent of our subjective experiences. Subjective number 16. Subjective idealism in ethical theories. In the realm of ethical theories, you're about to explore how personal perception and mental constructs can influence our understanding of right and wrong. You'll see how subjective idealism, a philosophical doctrine stating that the mind and ideas are the only things that can be definitively known, plays a significant role in shaping ethics. Subjective idealism posits that reality is a mental construct, and therefore ethical principles aren't universally objective. Rather, they're shaped by personal thoughts and experiences. This inherently subjective nature of ethics can be somewhat unsettling, as it means there's no definitive way to classify actions as absolutely right or wrong. Consider the moral relativism that subjective idealism promotes. If all reality, including ethical constructs, is subjective, then morality varies from person to person. What's seen as morally right for one individual might be viewed as wrong by another. This might seem disconcerting, but it's an inevitable consequence of subjective idealism. Subjective idealism, on the other hand, does not advocate for insanity or hopelessness. Instead, it encourages empathy and understanding of differing perspectives, prompting you to think critically about your beliefs and challenge any rigid moral absolutes you might hold. It's an invitation to engage in deep introspection and open discourse about ethics. Subjective number 17. Disagreements to subjective idealism. As you look deeper into the concept of subjective idealism, It's essential to consider the counterarguments that challenge its validity. These counterarguments provide a well-rounded perspective, allowing for a more comprehensive understanding of the philosophy. A fundamental disagreement to subjective idealism is the argument from realism. Simply put, realism posits that objects exist independently of one's perception. It's the simple idea that the world around you continues to exist, even when you're not observing it. This counters the subjective idealist's claim that objects cease to exist if not perceived. The argument from intersubjectivity also poses a challenge. This perspective holds that shared experiences provide evidence of an external reality. For instance, if two people observe the same tree, their shared experience suggests the tree's existence is independent of their individual perceptions. Another notable disagreement is the argument from predictability. This argues that the consistency and predictability of the world indicate an underlying objective reality. For example, when you drop a ball, you expect it to fall due to gravity, regardless of your perception. This predictability contradicts subjective idealism's assertion that the world is entirely contingent on one's perception. Finally, there's the argument from the inconceivability of solipsism. Solipsism, the belief that only one's mind is sure to exist, is a logical consequence of subjective idealism. However, most find solipsism inconceivable, countering the fundamental premise of subjective idealism. These disagreements underline the philosophical complexities surrounding subjective idealism, illuminating the multifaceted dialogue in the realm of philosophy. Subjective number 18. The role of consciousness in subjective idealism. You're now venturing into the role consciousness plays within this philosophy, where your awareness and perception become central to your understanding of reality. In the framework of subjective idealism, consciousness isn't a passive receiver. It actively constructs your reality. It's the canvas upon which your experiences are painted and the lens through which you interpret the world. You are not merely a spectator to an external, objective world in this philosophy. Rather, you are enabled to participate in the creation of your reality. Every perception, every thought, and every feeling you have contribute to your personal reality. This perspective challenges traditional views of consciousness as a mere byproduct of the brain's physical processes. It suggests that consciousness is something more fundamental, more integral to the fabric of reality itself. But remember, this isn't about solipsism or the idea that nothing exists outside your mind. Rather, it's about recognizing the role your consciousness plays in shaping what you perceive as reality. It's about acknowledging that your reality isn't just out there waiting to be discovered, but is constantly being created and recreated within your mind. Subjective number 19. How subjective idealism shapes personal identity. When it comes to your personal identity, it's shaped significantly by how you perceive and interpret your reality. This is the essence of subjective idealism, a philosophy asserting that your consciousness and perceptions form the basis of your reality. According to this view, the world you experience is a construct of your mind's interpretation of sensory information. Subjective idealism suggests that your identity isn't just a product of your physical existence, but is deeply interwoven with your mental processes. Your thoughts, perceptions, and emotions actively shape your reality, and in turn, your sense of self. Consider your beliefs and values. These are shaped by your perception of the world, and they feed back into your interpretation of reality. For example, if you perceive honesty as a high-value trait, this will influence how you interact with others, the choices you make, and ultimately, your self-concept. Moreover, your personal identity changes and evolves over time as your perceptions and interpretations of the world shift. This dynamic aspect underscores the fluidity of subjective idealism. It's not static. It's a continuous, active process of constructing and reconstructing your reality. In essence, subjective idealism places you at the center of your own universe, where your consciousness is the architect of your reality. By understanding this, you can better appreciate how profoundly your perceptions and interpretations shape your personal identity. This understanding provides a unique lens to explore and understand the self, offering a deeper level of self-awareness and introspection. Subjective number 20. Real-life examples of subjective idealism. Now that you have delved into how subjective idealism shapes personal identity, let's transition into exploring real-life examples of this philosophical concept. You will find that subjective idealism isn't just a lofty idea, but an approach that's actively practiced in daily life. Consider, for instance, your perception of color. You might see a rose as red, but someone else might perceive it as a different shade, or even a different color altogether due to color blindness. This example illustrates the core tenet of subjective idealism, that our reality is shaped by our individual perception. Similarly, let's bring this into the realm of taste. Isn't it remarkable how one person can relish a spicy dish, while another person will find the same dish intolerable? Here, too, subjective idealism is at play. The reality of the dish's spiciness is subjective to each person's unique taste buds and personal tolerance to spice. Moreover, think about how individuals perceive success. For one person, success might mean acquiring material wealth. For another, it could mean achieving a good work-life balance or contributing to societal change. Each individual's subjective idealism defines their reality of success. These examples demonstrate that subjective idealism isn't just a philosophical theory, but a practical perspective of life. It's a lens through which we interpret our experiences and construct our reality. The implications of subjective idealism, therefore, aren't just academic. They're personal and immediate, making this concept both fascinating and highly relevant to our lives. Subjective number 21. Key misunderstandings about subjective idealism. Despite its prevalence in everyday life, it's common for misconceptions to surround the philosophical concept of subjective idealism. You may be tempted to perceive it as an abstract idea detached from practical reality, but in truth, it's a deeply ingrained part of human cognition. One major misunderstanding is that subjective idealism denies the existence of an external world. On the contrary, it doesn't negate reality, but rather posits that our understanding of it is shaped by our perceptions. In other words, things exist, but what there is determined by how you perceive them. This isn't a denial of reality, but an acknowledgement of the role perception plays in shaping it. Another misconception is that subjective idealism is solipsistic, suggesting that only one's own mind is sure to exist. However, this isn't the case. Subjective idealism doesn't deny the existence of other minds. Instead, it asserts that we can only comprehend other minds through our own perceptions. Finally, it's often thought that subjective idealism equates to relativism, or the view that all perspectives are equally valid. While it does acknowledge the role of individual perception, it doesn't necessarily claim that all perceptions are equal. Some perceptions may be more aligned with the nature of reality than others. Subjective number 22. The future of subjective idealism studies. You will find that future studies in this field will likely focus on further elucidating the relationship between perception and our understanding of reality. As you delve deeper into the realm of subjective idealism, you will see a growing emphasis on how we construct our personal realities through sensory and cognitive processes. The future of subjective idealism research will likely pivot toward nuanced understandings of perception. It's not just about what we perceive, but how we perceive it. You will probably see more studies exploring how our perceptions are colored by our past experiences, cultural backgrounds, and personal biases. These factors shape the lens through which we view the world, and by extension, our subjective realities. Moreover, advancements in neuroscientific technologies could provide more in-depth insights into how our brains process and interpret sensory information. This could lead to a more comprehensive understanding of subjective idealism's neurological underpinnings. In the realm of philosophy, you can expect further exploration into the moral and ethical implications of subjective idealism. If our perception of reality is indeed subjective, what does this mean for our behavior, our relationships, and our societies? These questions hold profound implications for our understanding of human nature and morality. Lastly, you will probably see a greater incorporation of interdisciplinary approaches in future studies. By integrating insights from philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, and even quantum physics, researchers can develop a more holistic understanding of subjective idealism. This interdisciplinary approach can help unravel the complex interplay between perception and reality, offering you a more thorough comprehension of this fascinating philosophical theory. So, you have journeyed through the terrain of subjective idealism, meeting its pioneers and grappling with its core concepts. You've weighed it against objective idealism and delved deep into its role in shaping personal identity. Through real-life examples and debunking misconceptions, you have gotten a grasp of its intricate nature. As its future studies unfurl, remember, your perception is your reality. Contrastingly, it's not about the world shaping you. It's all about you shaping your world. Thanks for listening or reading this from Audiobook's office.